A wealthy old woman, bitter and cruel, humiliates every caregiver who dares to work for her. The story begins with an intense dismissal scene, showcasing her arrogance. Into this toxic world steps a calm black nurse, whose presence shakes the energy of the household. "Get out of my sight. I don't need your kind breathing my air." The words cut through the marble halls like shards of glass. Mrs. Eleanor Whitford, widow of a Steel Empire millionaire, raised her cane high and slammed it against the polished floor. The sound echoed. Her face, wrinkled yet sharp, was locked in a sneer, eyes glinting with the cold pride of someone who had always been obeyed. The young caregiver standing before her trembled. Tears welled up in her eyes. "Ma'am, I was only trying to help. You are useless," Eleanor hissed, pointing toward the door with her cane. "Like all the others. Weak hands, weak minds, and worse, no manners. Out!" The woman fled, her sobs trailing behind her. The butler sighed, closing the heavy oak door with a muted finality. Another one gone. Another casualty in a long line of nurses, caregivers, companions, all of whom had lasted no more than a week under Eleanor Whitford's tyranny. The Whitford mansion, a sprawling estate on the edge of the city, had become infamous in the caregiving world. The impossible mother, as people whispered, devoured workers and spat them out with cruelty sharper than any blade. Now the hallway stood empty again. The silence was broken only by Eleanor's labored breathing and the steady tick of the grandfather clock. Her son, Richard Whitford, slick, handsome, and forever impatient, strode into the room, adjusting his expensive suit. "Mother," he groaned, "do you realize how much this is costing me? Agencies are refusing us. They say no one will take the job anymore." Eleanor's lips curled. "Then let me die. Better than surrounding me with fools." Richard's jaw tightened. He had inherited his father's empire, but not his patience. For him, his mother was a burden, a storm he could neither silence nor abandon without scandal. "You're not dying, Mother. You're embarrassing me." Again, Eleanor cackled, a dry, cruel sound. "Embarrassment suits you. You were always too soft." The butler cleared his throat gently, his voice neutral yet purposeful. "Sir, there is one more applicant." Richard waved a dismissive hand. "They'll quit in a day." Eleanor's gaze narrowed, her arrogance undimmed. "Bring them in. Let me see which mouse dares enter the lion's den." The double doors opened slowly, and in walked a figure unlike any who had come before. Tall, poised, wearing a simple uniform of clean white, she carried no clipboard, no trembling nerves. Her eyes, deep, calm, unshaken, met Eleanor's with quiet defiance. She was black, her skin glowing warm against the golden light spilling through the hallway's windows. She did not bow. She did not flinch. She simply stood, steady as stone, her hands folded in front of her. Eleanor's lip curled at once. "Oh, this is rich. Now they send me charity cases." The woman spoke for the first time, her voice low but firm, each word carrying weight. "My name is Grace. I'm here to do the job no one else could." Richard chuckled under his breath. "You'll regret this, Miss Grace. Was it?" "My mother is impossible." Eleanor tapped her cane hard, glaring. "Impossible? I am Eleanor Whitford. People obey me. They always have." Grace stepped closer, her eyes steady, her presence unbothered. She bent down, not to bow, but to pick up the torn exam paper still lying on the marble floor from the previous caregiver's dismissal. She placed it gently on the nearby table, smoothing its edges, a symbolic act restoring what Eleanor had destroyed. Without saying a word, Eleanor's eyes narrowed further. She was used to fear, to trembling obedience. But this woman gave her something else, dignity without submission. "Do you know what they call me?" Eleanor sneered. "Yes," Grace answered calmly. "They call you impossible." The word sliced through the air like lightning. Even Richard froze. The butler held his breath. No one had ever dared say it to her face. Eleanor's cane trembled. "And yet you're here." Grace's lips curved in the faintest smile. "Because impossible doesn't scare me." The silence was electric. The mansion itself seemed to lean in, waiting for the explosion, but Grace only adjusted the strap of her bag and looked Eleanor in the eye. "You can dismiss me like all the others. or you can let me prove that no one is beyond care. Eleanor's heart, hidden behind decades of cruelty, skipped a beat she would never admit. For the first time in years, someone had dared to confront her power without breaking. Her cane lowered, just slightly. Richard blinked, stunned, and Grace, calm and steady, whispered the words that would begin to change everything. I'm not here to serve your pride, Mrs. Whitford. I'm here to remind you what respect feels like. The old woman's eyes flashed with fury, yet beneath the rage, a flicker of something else stirred. The impossible had just been challenged. The gates of the Beaumont estate creaked open like iron jaws, swallowing the small figure that stepped onto the marble driveway. The world outside had been noisy, ordinary, alive. Here, silence stretched like a verdict, heavy and deliberate. The mansion itself rose from the earth like a fortress, arched windows, towering columns, and glass panes, reflecting nothing but authority. Another one, muttered the gardener under his breath, pausing mid-trim. He had seen dozens of them come and go, nurses, caretakers, companions. None had lasted longer than a week. From the tall doorway, Mrs. Margaret Beaumont appeared like a queen surveying her kingdom. Silver hair swept into a severe bun, pearls at her throat, eyes like cold knives. She did not step forward. She expected the world to come to her. So she said, her voice slicing through the air, "They sent me." "You?" The black nurse paused at the foot of the steps. She held no luggage, only a small leather bag pressed firmly in her hand. She had seen eyes like this before, eyes that measured not the skill of her work, but the color of her skin. "Yes, ma'am," she answered softly, steady but not submissive. Margaret's lips curled. "I don't remember asking for charity cases, and I certainly don't tolerate outsiders meddling in this house. If you think kindness is enough to survive here, you'll be gone before nightfall." The staff lined the hall behind her, silent witnesses to the exchange. Some pitied, some smirked, already betting how long this one would last. The nurse climbed the steps slowly, every move deliberate. "I didn't come here for kindness," she said, her voice low but clear. "I came here to do my work. Whether I last or not, that isn't up to you." A flicker of surprise darted through Margaret's eyes, quickly hidden behind disdain. Inside, the mansion was a gallery of wealth. Oil paintings loomed from dark walls, chandeliers glittered with crystal arrogance, and floors shone like mirrors that refused to reflect warmth. The nurse's footsteps echoed in defiance of the hush. Margaret trailed behind her, circling like a predator. "Let me be very clear. My health is fragile. My nerves are fragile. My patience," she snapped her fingers, "non-existent. One mistake, one wrong word, and you're gone. Understood?" The nurse did not flinch. She stopped before a large portrait at the end of the hallway, a stern-looking man with the same icy eyes as Margaret. "Understood," she said. Her gaze lingered on the painting, and for a moment, Margaret wondered if this woman had seen more ghosts than she cared to admit. They entered the sitting room, sunlight bleeding through gold curtains. Margaret sank into a velvet chair, commanding from her throne. "You'll follow my routine exactly. I rise at 7. Tea must be hot, not warm. Music must play Bach, never Chopin. And don't think I won't notice a difference." The nurse set her bag gently on the table. "Routine keeps the body alive," she murmured, pulling out her tools. Then she looked up, her eyes steady. "But compassion keeps the spirit alive. Do you want me to tend to your body only, Mrs. Beaumont?" The question struck the air like glass shattering. The staff froze. Even Margaret's hand trembled faintly against the armrest before she quickly withdrew it. No one had ever dared to ask her what she wanted, only what she demanded. "You're insolent," Margaret hissed. "No, ma'am," the nurse replied calmly. "I'm honest. There's a difference." For the first time in years, Margaret's sharp retorts failed her. Something in this woman's tone unsettled her like a steady flame refusing to be smothered. The butler shifted uncomfortably, clearing his throat. "Shall I prepare the guest room for Miss Williams?" the nurse supplied. "Evelyn Williams." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "No need to unpack, Miss Williams. You won't be here long." Evelyn simply nodded, lifting her bag once more. "We'll see, ma'am. We'll see." As she followed the butler up the stairs, a soft murmur rippled through the staff below. Some shook their heads, certain she wouldn't last. Others exchanged glances, sensing something different this time. Margaret remained in her chair, her fingers gripping the pearl necklace at her throat. For the first time in a long time, she felt something unfamiliar, something she despised: uncertainty. And upstairs, in a dimly lit room overlooking the vast, lonely gardens, Evelyn unpacked her bag slowly. She placed a small photograph by the bedside, a picture of her mother smiling in a sunlit kitchen. It was a reminder, a silent vow. She whispered to herself, "I've faced worse than her, and I'm not leaving." The golden light from the window fell across her face, soft but unyielding. Just like her, the mansion woke slowly, like a beast stirring from slumber. Sunlight crawled across polished marble floors, catching the dust that danced in its beams. The staff moved in silence, rehearsing their roles in a performance they knew well: perfection for their mistress, or dismissal by noon. Evelyn Williams rose before dawn. She sat at the edge of her narrow bed, smoothing her uniform, her mother's photograph, watching quietly from the bedside table. Outside, the gardens were drenched in dew, the fountain's murmur steady and calm. She drew strength from that calmness. It reminded her of home, of mornings when struggle was normal but dignity was non-negotiable. By the time the grandfather clock struck 7, she was standing outside Margaret Beaumont's door. Her knuckles hovered over the polished oak. A breath. Then, gently, she knocked. "Enter," came the clipped voice from inside. The room was vast, dressed in silk curtains and heavy furniture. Margaret sat propped against embroidered pillows, her hair perfectly coiled despite just waking. On the nightstand rested a silver bell, her weapon of choice. "You're late," Margaret snapped. Though the clock had barely shifted a minute past the hour, Evelyn bowed her head slightly, not apologetic but respectful. "Your tea, ma'am." She placed a porcelain cup on the tray before Margaret. Steam curled into the air, carrying the earthy aroma of black tea. Margaret's eyes narrowed suspiciously. She lifted the cup, sipped, then slammed it back down. "Too hot." "I said warm, not boiling. Can you not follow simple instructions?" The butler, standing near the doorway, stiffened. He had seen this before. Margaret's game was not about the tea, it was about control. Evelyn met her employer's icy gaze. "Yes, ma'am, I'll adjust it." She took the cup without a flicker of frustration, poured it carefully into another vessel, then returned. "Try this." Margaret sipped again, her expression unreadable. "Better." "Barely." The test had begun. "Music," Margaret barked, pointing toward the phonograph in the corner. "Bach! And don't embarrass yourself." The staff shifted nervously. Only last week, a maid had chosen the wrong composition and had been dismissed. On the spot, Evelyn walked to the records, her hand hovering over the collection. She scanned titles quickly, then slid the correct one into place. The slow, commanding notes of Bach's cello suite filled the air, heavy with grace. Margaret's eyebrow twitched. "Lucky guess." "Not luck," Evelyn replied softly, adjusting the needle. "My mother used to play Bach on the piano when I studied." Margaret froze. The honesty in the nurse's tone unsettled her again, though she concealed it with a dismissive wave. "We're not here to talk about your past. You will sit quietly until I need you." Hours stretched. Margaret ordered the curtains drawn, then opened, then drawn again. She demanded pillows shifted, her chair angled precisely 3 degrees. The room warmed and cooled until the servants were sweating with exertion. Through it all, Evelyn complied without complaint, moving with steady patience. Finally, Margaret dismissed the others, leaving only Evelyn. "Do you know why I've dismissed every nurse before you?" she asked, her voice sharp. Evelyn paused. "Because they didn't meet your expectations?" Margaret smirked. "Because they forgot their place. They thought they could fix me. They thought their compassion mattered here." The words hung in the air, dripping with venom. Evelyn met them with silence, her calm presence like a mirror Margaret couldn't shatter. "Tell me," Margaret pressed, leaning forward. "Do you really think you'll last here longer than the rest?" Evelyn set her jaw. "I don't think about lasting, ma'am. I think about doing what's right. Whether that earns me time or dismissal, that's not for me to decide." The reply landed like a stone dropped in still water. Margaret's lips parted, but no sound came. Downstairs, the cook whispered to the gardener, "She's still there." "After all that?" "Still there," the gardener muttered, glancing toward the ceiling. "And she doesn't look like she's leaving by evening." Margaret sat by the fire, staring into the flames. Evelyn stood quietly behind her chair, hands folded. For once, the older woman had run out of tests. She sipped her tea, this time without complaint. "You'll make mistakes," Margaret said suddenly, almost reluctantly. "And when you do, I won't forgive them." Evelyn nodded once. "Then I'll do my best not to make them." For the first time, Margaret found herself unsettled not by defiance, but by dignity. When Evelyn retired to her room that night, she placed her hand gently over her mother's photograph and whispered, "Day one passed." But she knew the true tests were only just beginning. The Beaumont mansion stood like a fortress of pride, its towering walls gleaming in the morning sun. But inside, the air carried a different weight, thick with whispers, unseen glances, and silent fears. Evelyn had begun to notice it during her second week. Every polished surface seemed to conceal something darker beneath. A tea breakfast service, the butler adjusted the silverware with mechanical precision, his face an unreadable mask. Yet Evelyn caught the tremor in his hands when Margaret scolded him for a spoon placed an inch too far to the left. The maid in the hallway avoided Evelyn's gaze entirely, darting past with her head lowered as if speaking might cost her livelihood. It was a house of obedience, not loyalty. Margaret, of course, remained the center of it all. Each morning she sat like a queen in her velvet armchair, sharp eyes scrutinizing every movement. Her cane leaned beside her, polished but unused, a symbol of the weakness she refused to admit. One afternoon, Evelyn was asked to fetch Margaret's medication from the study. As she walked through the dimly lit corridor, her eyes landed on a cabinet slightly ajar. Inside lay neatly arranged bottles, prescriptions in tidy rows, but something was off. The labels bore dates that stretched months back. Dust clung to several. Some pills had expired. Evelyn frowned. Carefully, she checked the most recent prescription. The dosage was higher than any she had ever administered to Margaret. Her instincts told her the doctor, an old friend of the family, wasn't treating her. He was pacifying her. When she returned with the pills, she watched Margaret closely as she swallowed them with her tea. The woman's face betrayed nothing, but Evelyn noted the slight wince when her hand brushed her abdomen. "Something wrong, ma'am?" Evelyn asked gently. Margaret snapped her gaze upward. "Your concern is unnecessary. I am not one of your little hospital patients." Evelyn lowered her eyes, hiding her thoughts. "As you say, ma'am." But later, when Margaret retired to her chambers, Evelyn overheard a muffled cough behind the door. It wasn't the sharp cough of a cold, it was deeper, heavier, the kind that carried secrets. That night, Evelyn couldn't sleep. She sat by the window in her small room, the moonlight spilling across her lap, her mother's photograph glowing faintly beside her. She whispered, "She's not just cruel, she's in pain." The next day, Margaret's temper flared more than usual. She scolded the cook for underseasoning the soup, berated the gardener for trimming roses unevenly, and criticized Evelyn for the way she folded blankets. But beneath the storm, Evelyn recognized something new, an edge of desperation. By evening, Margaret sat by the fire, her cane clutched tighter than before. Evelyn stood nearby, silent as always. The flames painted Margaret's face in shades of exhaustion. For the first time, the proud woman didn't look like a queen. She looked small. "Tell me, Nurse Williams," Margaret said suddenly, her voice quieter than usual. "Do you ever tire of pretending?" Evelyn blinked. "Pretending, ma'am?" Margaret's lips curled into a bitter smile. "Yes, pretending you care. Pretending your presence here is more than a paycheck." Evelyn chose her words carefully. "I don't pretend, ma'am. I care because it's who I am, not because of where I work." Silence fell. The crackling fire was the only sound. Margaret turned her gaze toward the flames, her expression unreadable. For a moment, Evelyn thought the conversation had ended. Then, softly, Margaret said, My husband used to sit by this fire. He was the only one who ever spoke to me without fear. Now, even the walls whisper behind my back." Evelyn's heart tightened. The servants' silence, the doctor's neglect, the endless cycle of cruelty. It wasn't power that held Margaret's world together. It was fear. And fear, Evelyn realized, was nothing but loneliness wearing a crown. Before she could respond, Margaret straightened in her chair, her mask snapping back into place. "Enough talk. Tomorrow, we begin earlier. If you intend to last, you'll need more discipline." "Yes, ma'am," Evelyn replied softly. Later that night, as Evelyn prepared to rest, the butler slipped quietly into the hallway. His voice was barely a whisper. "Careful, Miss Williams. You're not the first to think you can change her." Evelyn met his weary eyes. "Maybe not, but maybe I'll be the last." For the first time since she entered the mansion, she felt the walls themselves listening. And somewhere deep inside, a crack had begun to form in Margaret's fortress. The morning sun draped the Beaumont gardens in gold, every rose petal catching the light like stained glass. Servants moved about in hushed tones, trimming hedges and sweeping paths, but their eyes lingered on Evelyn as she guided Margaret down the stone walkway. "Slower," Margaret snapped, her hand tightening on Evelyn's arm. "You pull me like I'm a child," Evelyn bit back a retort. "I only wish to keep you steady, ma'am." "I am steady," Margaret said, though her lips trembled slightly as she pressed her cane against the gravel path. The roses were in bloom, their scent thick in the warm air. Yet Margaret's breath grew shallow as they moved along the trail. Evelyn noticed how her steps shortened, how her shoulders hunched with effort. Sweat formed along her temples despite the cool breeze. "You need to rest," Evelyn said firmly. Margaret's eyes flashed. "I need nothing but peace from your constant fussing." But only a few steps later, her defiance betrayed her. Margaret's cane slipped on the stones, and her knees buckled. Evelyn lunged forward just in time, catching her before she crumpled onto the path. The older woman gasped, her face pale as parchment, her breath rattling. "Ma'am," Evelyn lowered her gently to the bench nearby. Margaret clutched at her chest, fingers trembling. The servants froze, watching in shock. No one dared move closer. "Water," Evelyn barked. The gardener scrambled, fumbling with his canteen and rushing it over. Evelyn pressed it to Margaret's lips, coaxing her to sip. "Steady breaths, in and out. Stay with me." Margaret's eyes flickered open, wide with something Evelyn had never seen in them before: fear. For a moment, the proud mistress was gone. In her place sat a frail woman struggling against her own body. "Don't," Margaret whispered hoarsely. "Don't let them see." Evelyn leaned closer, shielding her from the other's view. "Then listen to me. You're not well. Those pills aren't enough. You need real care." Margaret's jaw clenched. "No hospitals. No strangers poking and prodding me. You'll die if you don't," Evelyn said, her tone sharper than she intended. Something flickered across Margaret's face: anger, pride, then resignation. She looked away, her gaze fixed on the roses trembling in the breeze. The moment stretched until Margaret finally whispered, "Help me inside. No one must know." With quiet strength, Evelyn lifted her arm around her shoulders, guiding her back toward the mansion. The servants stepped aside, bowing their heads but exchanging uneasy glances. Inside the grand halls, Margaret sank into her armchair, her fingers still trembling faintly. Evelyn knelt beside her, checking her pulse. It was rapid, unsteady. "I'll prepare broth and water," Evelyn said. "You need rest." Margaret gave a bitter laugh. "Rest? That's all anyone tells me now. Rest, as if lying still will keep death from my door." Evelyn met her eyes. "It won't, but facing it alone will make it worse." The words hung in the air, bold and uninvited. Evelyn feared she had crossed a line, but instead of fury, she saw something else in Margaret's expression, a glimmer of vulnerability quickly smothered beneath pride. "You presume much for a nurse," Margaret murmured. "I presume only what I see," Evelyn replied softly. Margaret turned her gaze to the fire, silent. Her knuckles whitened on the armrest as if clinging to the last fragments of control. Later that evening, Evelyn found herself in the study, searching through the dusty prescriptions again. The pattern was clear now. The doctor had been increasing the dosages, masking symptoms rather than treating them. It wasn't negligence. It was deliberate appeasement. Perhaps Margaret herself had demanded it, too proud to admit weakness. Evelyn closed the cabinet with a heavy sigh. She was trapped between duty and defiance. To challenge the doctor meant risking her position, perhaps her future. But to remain silent meant allowing Margaret to wither in secret. When she returned to the sitting room, Margaret was dozing lightly in her chair. Her face, free from its usual scowl, seemed almost peaceful. In sleep, she was no tyrant, no wealthy mistress, just a woman, weary and human. Evelyn draped a blanket over her shoulders. Margaret stirred, murmuring faintly. Evelyn leaned closer, catching a whisper that made her pause. Edward. The name carried a softness Evelyn had never heard in her voice before. It wasn't anger, nor command, it was longing. Evelyn stepped back quietly, allowing her to rest. For the first time, she realized Margaret Beaumont was not invincible. She was a fortress, yes, but one with unseen cracks running deep through the stone, and Evelyn, whether she wished it or not, was becoming the only one strong enough to step inside. Rain lashed against the tall windows of the Beaumont estate, streaking the glass with silver trails. The storm outside matched the unease swirling in Evelyn's chest. She sat in the quiet study, sorting through papers Margaret had left scattered across the desk. Most were unimportant old invitations, garden receipts, donations to the church. But then Evelyn found something different. A faded photograph, half tucked beneath a ledger. It showed a young Margaret, radiant, smiling in a way Evelyn could hardly imagine now. Beside her stood a tall man in uniform, his hand gently resting on hers. At the bottom, a handwritten scrawl, Edward, 1944. The name echoed in Evelyn's mind. She remembered the way Margaret had murmured it in her sleep, soft as prayer. Whoever Edward was, he had mattered deeply. Before she could think further, Margaret's voice cut through the silence. "Why are you rifling through my things?" Evelyn startled, quickly setting the photograph down. Margaret stood in the doorway, her shawl clutched tightly, her eyes sharp despite the exhaustion that still clung to her. "I was tidying," Evelyn replied evenly. "You left these out." Margaret's gaze darted to the photograph. For a flicker of a second, her mask slipped. Pain, raw and unguarded, flashed across her face before the fortress returned. "Leave it," she snapped. "Some memories are not for strangers' eyes." Evelyn hesitated, then bowed her head. "As you wish." The rest of the day passed in brittle silence. Margaret barely spoke, her replies clipped and cold, though her movements betrayed her weariness. She stumbled once in the hallway, clutching at the wall, but waved Evelyn away when she rushed forward. By evening, the storm had calmed. Evelyn carried Margaret's supper into the sitting room, simple broth and bread. Margaret barely touched it. "You need strength," Evelyn urged gently. "I need peace," Margaret muttered, pushing the tray aside. Evelyn studied her closely. The proud woman's hands trembled faintly as she reached for her teacup. Her face seemed paler than yesterday, the lines around her mouth deeper. "Peace doesn't come from starving yourself," Evelyn said. Margaret gave a dry laugh. "You speak as though you've known suffering, child. But suffering wears many faces. Some wounds cannot be fed away." The words carried a weight Evelyn hadn't heard before. They weren't sharp. They were heavy, almost mournful. Later that night, as Margaret dozed in her chair, Evelyn stepped quietly into the corridor. She needed air, needed to think. The house was vast and echoing, its shadows deepened by the storm's aftermath. She wandered until she reached the servants' quarters. There, hushed voices carried through a half-open door. "She's slipping faster," one maid whispered. "I," another replied. "And still she hides it. Won't see a doctor proper. Won't let the family know. Always was proud, Mrs. Beaumont." Ever since. A pause. "Since Edward." Evelyn's heart quickened. She leaned closer. "Don't speak his name too loud," the maid warned. "That wound never healed. Some say it's what made her hard. Love taken too soon. War stealing him away." The words blurred as Evelyn stepped back, her mind racing. Edward had been real. More than real, he had shaped Margaret's life. Her bitterness, her pride. When she returned to the sitting room, Margaret stirred awake, her eyes narrowing at Evelyn's presence. "You linger too much," she said, "because I care too much," Evelyn replied softly. Something shifted in Margaret's expression. For a heartbeat, her eyes softened, as if she longed to believe it. But the moment passed, replaced with the familiar steel. "You care because it is your job. Do not mistake duty for devotion." Evelyn met her gaze without flinching. "Sometimes they become the same." The words hung in the air like smoke. Margaret looked away, her fingers tightening on the armrest. She said nothing more that night, but as Evelyn tucked the blanket around her and dimmed the lamps, she noticed Margaret's hand trembling again, not just from weakness, but from something deeper, fear. Evelyn returned to her small quarters, lying awake long after midnight. The storm outside had passed, but another storm, hidden, human, and fragile, was gathering inside the walls of the Beaumont estate. Margaret Beaumont was cracking, and beneath the cracks lay a story Evelyn was determined to uncover, no matter the cost. The sun rose pale and cold over the Beaumont estate, painting the stone walls in muted light. Evelyn stood at the kitchen sink, staring out into the sprawling gardens. Sleep had been shallow, broken by the echo of the name she had overheard the servants whisper. Edward. It rolled in her thoughts like a tide, soft, persistent, impossible to silence. When she carried Margaret's morning tea upstairs, she found the older woman already awake, sitting rigid in her armchair. The shawl around her shoulders looked heavier than before, as though it bore not just warmth but weight. "You rise early," Evelyn said carefully, setting the tray on the side table. Margaret gave no reply. Her eyes were fixed on the window, unblinking, as if searching for something far beyond the hedges and treetops. "Storm has passed," Evelyn tried again, her tone gentle. Margaret stirred faintly, her lips parting. "Storms do not pass, child. They only pause, waiting for their moment to return." Evelyn swallowed, unsure if Margaret spoke of the weather or something deeper. Later that morning, Evelyn busied herself with household chores, dusting shelves and polishing silver. Yet her mind drifted always back to that faded photograph. The way Margaret's face had softened beside Edward's, so unlike the woman she was now. By midday, Evelyn returned to the sitting room to find Margaret struggling to reach a book from the high shelf. The cane lay at her side, forgotten. She stretched for the leather spine, her hand trembling. "Let me help," Evelyn said quickly, rushing forward. Margaret stiffened. "I do not need," but before she could finish, her grip slipped. Evelyn caught the book just before it tumbled to the floor. She placed it gently in Margaret's lap. Margaret stared at it for a long time. The title was Poems of the Great War. "You were right to stop me," Margaret murmured, her voice low. "My body betrays me more each day." "It's not betrayal," Evelyn said softly. "It's simply time asking for kindness." Margaret's eyes flickered to her, sharp but uncertain. "Kindness is a luxury, one I learned long ago not to expect." Her fingers traced the book's cover, hesitating before she opened it. Between the pages lay a folded letter, its edges yellowed with age. Evelyn caught the faint outline of handwriting but looked away, giving Margaret her privacy. Still, Margaret must have sensed her curiosity. "Do you know what war takes, Miss Evelyn?" she asked suddenly. Evelyn shook her head. "It takes everything," Margaret whispered. "Husbands, brothers, futures. It leaves you with shadows and echoes. And the world expects you to move on, as though love can be buried like the dead." Her voice cracked on the last word. For the first time, Evelyn saw not the formidable lady of the house, but a woman carved hollow by grief. Evelyn knelt beside her. "Edward?" she asked softly. The name hung between them like a bell tolling in a silent church. Margaret's eyes snapped to hers, wide and raw. "Who told you that name?" I overheard," Evelyn admitted gently. "The maid spoke of him, and I saw the photograph." For a moment, Evelyn thought Margaret might dismiss her, retreat back into her fortress. But instead, Margaret sagged deeper into her chair, as though the weight of keeping silent had grown too heavy. He was my fiancé, Margaret whispered. The only man who ever saw me not as wealth, not as duty, but as Margaret. Just Margaret, her. Fingers tightened on the book. He went to war, promised he'd return. Letters came, one after another, full of hope, full of dreams. And then, she broke off, swallowing hard. And then they stopped, tears welled in her eyes, trembling but unspilled. Evelyn's chest ached. She reached out, covering Margaret's trembling hand with her own. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. Margaret drew a shaky breath. "I built these walls because I could not survive otherwise. Pride became my armor, but sometimes late at night, I wonder if I buried myself alive within it." The silence that followed was thick but not empty. For the first time, Evelyn felt the walls truly shifting, not just cracking, but opening. "You don't have to face it alone anymore," Evelyn said gently. Margaret looked at her, and though her lips trembled, she did not pull her hand away. Evening fell quietly, wrapping the house in shades of amber. As Evelyn prepared to leave for the night, Margaret's voice halted her at the door. "Stay," Margaret said softly. "Just sit with me a while longer." Evelyn turned, surprised, but smiled. She moved back to the armchair across from Margaret and sat in silence. Outside, the wind stirred through the trees, a lullaby of rustling leaves, and inside, for the first time in decades, Margaret Beaumont allowed another soul to share her grief. The next morning, Evelyn moved quietly through the halls, her footsteps softened by the thick carpets. She carried a tray with fresh tea and buttered scones, unsure whether Margaret would welcome her after last night's confession. But when she entered the sitting room, she found the older woman awake, a shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, the war poetry book resting on her lap. Margaret looked up as Evelyn entered, and though her face was stern, her eyes no longer carried the same cold distance. "You stayed," Margaret said, her tone measured. "Yes," Evelyn replied simply, setting down the tray. A silence stretched between them, but it was not sharp. It felt cautious, almost fragile, like glass newly mended. Margaret tapped the book's spine with a bony finger. "He sent me a poem once, not his own, but one he copied. Said it reminded him of me. Would you like to hear it?" Evelyn nodded. Margaret opened the pages with slow care, unfolding the old letter tucked inside. Her voice trembled as she read. "Though seas divide, though battles rage, my heart remains with you. And when the world forgets my name, your love shall see me through." Her words faltered on the final line. She folded the letter shut, pressing it against her chest. Evelyn felt tears prick her eyes, though she kept them contained. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Margaret's jaw tightened. "Beauty does not bring him back." Yet the bitterness in her tone lacked conviction. It sounded more like a habit than a belief. Later that day, Evelyn helped Margaret into the garden. The air smelled of damp earth, freshly washed by the storm. Autumn roses still bloomed stubbornly along the hedges, their colors striking against the gray sky. Margaret leaned heavily on her cane, but she did not complain. They walked slowly, Evelyn at her side, until they reached a stone bench near the fountain. Margaret sat with effort, her eyes traveling across the flowers. "I used to come here with Edward," she murmured, almost to herself. "He said these gardens felt like another world, untouched by war, untouched by sorrow. I hated him for saying it, because I knew it wasn't true." Evelyn hesitated. "And yet you still come here." Margaret's gaze softened. "Because some part of me wanted to believe him." For a while, they sat in silence, the fountain's steady trickle filling the air. Evelyn glanced at Margaret's profile, still proud, still unyielding, yet marked with a grief that time had not erased. "You've carried this alone for so long," Evelyn said quietly. "No one should have to." Margaret turned sharply. "And what would you know of it? What burdens have you carried, Miss Evelyn?" The words stung, but Evelyn steadied herself. "Loss isn't measured like coin, ma'am. Grief is grief, no matter how large or small." Margaret's eyes narrowed, as though to rebuke her, but then she stopped. Her lips pressed together, and for once, she seemed unsure. That evening, as Evelyn prepared Margaret's supper, She heard faint laughter echo from the parlor. It startled her. The sound was delicate, almost foreign, like a melody long forgotten. She stepped into the room to see Margaret holding the photograph of Edward. Her shoulders shook, but not from sorrow. "He once tripped over his own boots trying to impress me," Margaret said suddenly, glancing at Evelyn. "Called it a dance of gallantry. Foolish man." Evelyn smiled softly. "Sounds charming." Margaret's lips curved, though faintly. "Charming, yes, and unbearably stubborn, much like you." The words caught Evelyn off guard. "Me? You pry where others retreat," Margaret said. "You sit when others leave. That is not something I expected." Her voice softened, almost unwillingly. "Perhaps I needed it." Evelyn's heart swelled. She saw it now, the cracks forming in the fortress walls, fragile but real. That night, Margaret surprised her again. As Evelyn gathered her things to leave, Margaret spoke quietly from her chair. "Tomorrow," she said, eyes still fixed on the fire, "I would like to show you something. Something I have not shared in many years." Evelyn paused, curiosity alight. "What is it?" Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line, as though the answer itself weighed heavy. "Edward's last letter. The one I never opened." Evelyn drew a slow breath. "You've kept it sealed all this time?" Margaret nodded, her gaze distant. "I could not bear the words. If I read them, it would mean the end was real, that he was truly gone." She looked at Evelyn then, her eyes searching, almost pleading. "But perhaps it is time." Evelyn stepped closer, her voice steady but gentle. "If you wish, I'll be there with you." Margaret's shoulders sagged, relief flickering across her face. "Yes," she whispered, "I think I would like that." The fire crackled in the hearth, casting long shadows across the walls. And for the first time in decades, Margaret Beaumont prepared to face the letter that had haunted her life. The next morning dawned quietly, the sun breaking through pale clouds, with a gentleness that seemed almost deliberate. Evelyn entered the Beaumont estate with a sense of anticipation humming inside her chest. She carried Margaret's breakfast as usual, yet her thoughts were not on the tray. They were on the promise, the unopened letter waiting to be revealed. When she entered Margaret's room, she found the older woman seated at her writing desk, already dressed in a dark velvet gown. Margaret's hands rested on the desk surface, and between them lay a small envelope, its edges yellowed, its seal unbroken. Evelyn froze. "You found it?" she whispered. Margaret didn't look up. "It was never lost. I kept it in this drawer for over 40 years. Every day I saw it. Every day I turned away." Her fingers brushed lightly across the paper, as though afraid it might crumble. Evelyn set down the tray and moved closer, the air heavy with reverence. "Do you wish to read it now?" Margaret hesitated, her eyes fixed on the letter, her lips trembling with an emotion Evelyn had never seen in her before, fear. "I am not certain," Margaret said, her voice brittle. "For so long, I believed I could not bear the truth it contained. But now I fear it may vanish with me if I do not face it." Evelyn placed a gentle hand on Margaret's shoulder. "You don't have to do it alone." Margaret's jaw tightened. Slowly, deliberately, she broke the seal. The room seemed to hold its breath as Margaret unfolded the fragile paper. Her hands shook slightly, but her eyes were steady as she began to read aloud. "My dearest Margaret, if you're holding this, then I am likely gone, or soon to be. The world is cruel in its demands, yet I could not leave without leaving you these words. Know first what is truest. I have loved you with a depth I scarcely understood until I faced the end." Margaret's voice quivered, and for a moment Evelyn thought she might stop, but she pressed on. "I do not want you to grieve forever. If my life is the price for others to live, then let it be so. Carry my love in laughter, in gardens, in music, in the small joys of each day. Do not let the war claim you too, my Margaret. Live boldly. Even if I cannot." Tears streamed down Margaret's cheeks as her voice faltered over the final lines. "And when the roses bloom in autumn, think of me, for I shall be there in every petal that refuses to fade." The letter fell silent. Margaret clutched the paper to her chest, her breath shuddering. Evelyn stood quietly, her own eyes wet. For a long time neither spoke, the room filled only with the ticking clock and Margaret's soft sobs. Finally, Margaret whispered, "All these years, I thought it would break me. But instead, it feels as though he has returned, just for a moment." Evelyn nodded gently. "He wanted you to live, not to wither." Margaret gave a broken laugh, her tears still falling. "How foolish I have been, locking myself away, clinging to bitterness, when he asked me to do the opposite." Her hands trembled as she smoothed the paper, laying it carefully back on the desk. "I wasted so many years." Evelyn sat beside her. "Perhaps, but not all is lost. You are still here, and his words reached you at last." Margaret turned her gaze toward Evelyn, studying her with a new kind of clarity. "You are right. It is not too late, is it?" "No," Evelyn said firmly. "It is never too late to live." Later that afternoon, Margaret asked to be taken to the garden again. Evelyn guided her slowly down the path until they reached the roses. Margaret touched one of the blossoms, her frail fingers brushing the petals with almost childlike wonder. "They are stubborn things," she said softly, "still blooming, even as the cold creeps in." Evelyn smiled. "Like you." Margaret gave a quiet laugh, the sound tender. Edward was right. These gardens are another world. I simply could not see it then. For the first time, Evelyn saw not just grief in Margaret's eyes, but peace. It was fragile, yes, but real. That evening, Evelyn prepared to leave, but Margaret stopped her at the door. "Evelyn," she called, her voice steadier than it had been in years. Evelyn turned. Margaret held the letter in her hand. "I want you to keep a copy of this. If my strength fades again, remind me of what he asked. Remind me to live." Evelyn's throat tightened with emotion. "I will." Margaret nodded slowly. "Then tomorrow, perhaps we shall do something different. Something I have not dared in decades." "What is that?" Evelyn asked. Margaret's lips curved in the faintest of smiles. "We shall laugh." The firelight danced across her face, no longer casting only shadows but revealing something luminous, something reborn. For Evelyn, it was clear. The letter had not ended Edward's story. It had given Margaret a beginning. The following morning, the Beaumont estate seemed lighter, as though the very walls had exhaled. Sunlight spilled generously through the tall windows, catching motes of dust that danced like tiny sparks in the air. Evelyn arrived early, her steps quickened by a sense of anticipation she could not explain. Something was shifting within Margaret, something Evelyn longed to nurture. When she entered the sitting room, she found Margaret by the window. The older woman was not dressed in her usual dark gowns, but instead wore a pale lavender shawl that softened her figure. Her silver hair was neatly pinned, and though her body remained frail, her posture was upright, proud. "Good morning," Margaret said, her voice carrying warmth Evelyn had never heard before. Evelyn smiled. "Good morning, ma'am. You seem brighter today." Margaret nodded. "Last night I dreamed of him, Edward. But not as he was in the war. He was here, in the garden, laughing. I woke with his words still ringing in my ears. 'Do not let the war claim you too.'" Her eyes glistened, but there was no heaviness in them, only resolve. "I would like to do something today," she said, surprising Evelyn. "Something I have avoided for too long. I want to go to the rose garden with scissors in hand. I want to cut a rose myself." Evelyn's heart stirred. "Of course. Shall I help you dress warmly?" "Yes," Margaret said, with a smile so fragile and yet so radiant that Evelyn thought it might shatter her own heart. The two women stepped into the autumn air, the sky painted with strokes of pale gold and silver. The garden awaited them like an old friend. The roses, stubborn, defiant, alive, still bloomed despite the season's chill. Margaret leaned on Evelyn's arm as they walked slowly down the gravel path. Her steps were uncertain but determined. When they reached the center of the garden, Evelyn handed her the small silver scissors she had brought. Margaret's fingers trembled as she reached toward a deep red bloom. She hesitated for a moment, her eyes closing as though offering a silent prayer. Then, with a steady breath, she cut the stem. The rose fell gently into her palm. She brought it to her face, inhaling its fragrance, her eyes flooding with tears. "It is the first rose I have cut in 40 years," she whispered. And it feels as though Edward is standing beside me. Evelyn swallowed the lump in her throat. He is. In this moment, he is here. They lingered in the garden, speaking softly of Edward, of the years that had slipped away, of the courage it took to finally embrace life again. Margaret's words flowed more freely than Evelyn had ever known, as though the letter had unlocked something that had long been sealed. At last, Margaret turned to Evelyn. You must promise me something, anything. Evelyn replied. When I am gone, Margaret said, her tone calm and steady. Do not let this house fall silent again. Open the gardens. Let others walk among the roses. Let this place be filled with laughter, with life. That is what he would have wanted. And it is what I want now. Evelyn's chest tightened. I promise. I'll make sure of it. Margaret reached for her hand, squeezing it with surprising strength. Good. Then Edward's words will live on not only in me, but in all who come after. That evening, as the sun sank and shadows lengthened across the estate, Evelyn tucked Margaret into bed. The lavender shawl still clung to her shoulders, and the rose she had cut rested in a small vase by her bedside. Margaret smiled faintly. It is strange. I feel lighter now, as though I have finally laid a burden down. The years I wasted are gone, but the moments I have left are mine to claim. That is enough. Evelyn brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. Rest now. Tomorrow, we'll go to the garden again. Margaret's eyes closed, her lips curving in peace. Yes, tomorrow. But tomorrow never came. Margaret passed quietly in the night, the rose still fresh beside her. When Evelyn found her the next morning, she felt no crushing despair, only sorrow laced with gratitude. Margaret had left this world not in bitterness, but in peace. Her last days spent in the embrace of the roses Edward had once promised would bloom even through sorrow. Weeks later, Evelyn fulfilled her promise. The Beaumont Gardens opened to the townsfolk. Children laughed as they chased one another down the paths. Families strolled among the blossoms, and elderly couples sat hand in hand on benches once shrouded in silence. The estate, once a monument to grief, became a sanctuary of life. At the center of the rose garden stood a plaque, newly placed by Evelyn. It bore an inscription Margaret herself had chosen. For Edward, who loved with courage. For Margaret, who finally chose to live. And for all who walk among the roses, may you find peace here. Evelyn often stood before that plaque, the words echoing in her heart. She knew Margaret and Edward's story had not ended with death. It lived on in every laugh that rang through the garden, in every rose that defied the winter, in every soul who came searching for beauty and left carrying hope. And whenever the autumn roses bloomed, Evelyn would smile, remembering the woman who had once thought herself lost, but who, in the end, had found her way back to love, back to life, and back to the roses.